Hello and welcome back to Everything Phil Collins. Let's talk about Dance into the Light. That's such an interesting album. We're going to talk about the era. Here's everything we're going to do in today's episode. We're going to talk about the vibrancy of the sound and the overall sound of the different songs on the record. We're going to go track by track as we do with every album review. I want to talk about this era, where we find Phil Collins in 1996. I want to talk about the album cover, very different from the other ones. We'll talk a little bit about the stats of this record, the tour, what Phil says about this album in his book. Let's do all things Dance into the Light. Huge shout out, as always, to our Patreons who support this channel every single month. And we do some cool things over there at Patreon, including a very interesting Chester Thompson giveaway that we'll be doing sometime this month as soon as I get the test pressing in hand, but no other details I'm going to give. So come on over there and you get some a chance to enter into some exclusive contests, as well as a bunch of videos that aren't here on the main channel. Go to patreon.com/everythingphilcollins, and thank you to our patrons. So I want to talk about the stats. Let's do the stats real quick. This came out on October 8th of 1996. This would have been after Both Sides, a while after Both Sides, and just before Tarzan. Would have been just before Calling All Stations, which was in 1997. This was produced by Hugh Padgham, which I did not know that. I just learned that 10 seconds ago. It's very interesting. It kind of doesn't sound like it, in my opinion. The first single was Dance into the Light, which came out in September. It's in Your Eyes was the next single. That's my favorite song. No Matter Who, Wear My Hat, The Same Moon. All really great songs. I'm a big fan. Full disclosure, I'm a big fan of this record. I really am. There's a few, I think it's a bit bloated, as were most records in the 90s, people realizing that they had more room to work with on a CD than they did on cassette. Well, cassette was infinite as well, I think, in a way. But certainly more than vinyl. I do think it's a little bloated. Phil doesn't talk about this album very much in the book, just like a little story about Oasis and then just a few little notes. He talks more about the tour, which he was more excited about the tour, which is very interesting because the Trip into the Light or the Dance into the Light tour, or Trip into the Light, Live and Loose in Paris is the DVD that came out. I love that. I love the set list. I love the round stage, conga lines. It just looked like a very energetic show. To be honest with you, if I were to go back to any show, I would maybe want to, like go back in time. I would maybe want to go to that show because it just looks so exciting and so fun. Phil talked about really just, there is the kind of Afro Latin American vibes of this record. To me, the sound of this record is split in two. And so Phil talks a lot about the guitar music. And I think there was some photo shoots and music videos of him playing left-handed guitar. I think it was Paul McCartney's guitar. There was a lot of guitar music. He was inspired by what was happening on the radio, which would have been, Oasis and Radiohead and Hootie and the Blowfish and kind of guitar-based music, which was kind of cool. And so he would just take his normal rock sensibilities and his melody sensibilities and combine that with just kind of more like straightforward up and down type strumming songs. It really actually worked really well. Some of my favorite songs are on that side of the album. And by that side, I mean, I feel like the album is split down the middle. You have this kind of Caribbean, Latin cruise ship sound to stuff like Dance into the Light and Wear My Hat and River So Wide. And then on the other side, you have just kind of like the straightforward Beatles-esque tunes, like It's in Your Eyes and No Matter Who and Love Police. That's What You Said. When I first heard this album, I heard this album really late. So this record would have come out when I was in high school. And listening to Phil Collins wasn't a cool thing to do in the late 90s in high school. And so I had grown up with Phil Collins and Genesis, but they had kind of taken a back seat. And so I didn't really pay attention to this record or Both Sides, and even Tarzan until some of my peers started talking about Tarzan. But when this record came out, I wasn't really even aware that it came out. There was no internet back then. Well, there was no social media back then, so I wouldn't have been aware of it. In fact, funny story, here's a copy of the cassette I picked up recently. But when I was driving in my friend's Chevy Lumina, you remember those? I can show you think it's called a Chevy Lumina. Anyway, his dad was a big music fan, big Phil fan, and he had a copy of this. And I was like, what is this on the radio or in the cassette deck? And so my friend passed me this cassette deck. I was like, oh my gosh, a huge fan of Phil Collins. And I was just like reading through the liner notes. I had been hearing It's in Your Eyes on the radio. And I really, to this day, it's in my like top 10, I think. Top 10, top 15 Phil Collins songs. I really like that song. So anyway, I was in high school and I was kind of made aware that that Phil was back and he was doing upbeat music again. And then this kind of parlayed a year later or so, 2 years later, into Tarzan. While Dance into the Light is a bit of a damp squid, the tour is a bit of a rocket. My sixth solo album, Dance into the Light, is released later that year in October 1996. The title and the sound are symbolic. This is an optimistic album full of brightness and colors. I split the album into two sounds, the Beatles-esque rock guitar songs, and then the kind of Caribbean, Latin, but also Afro sounds too, because you have Lorenzo, which talks about East Africa. You have River So Wide, which kind of has more of a jungle or like a tribal sound to it. I don't know. I feel like this record, I'm very curious. I would love to ask Phil and love if any of you know if this has been talked about, the crossover between Tarzan and Dance into the Light, because they share similar sounds. And I would imagine as this album is wrapping up, some maybe castaways are being used for Tarzan, or we're kind of following this sound into Tarzan, or was he working on Tarzan, writing it for Tarzan at the same time? I mean, he would have had to have been, because I think Tarzan came out in 98. And usually they work on those movies like 3 or 4 years earlier. So there's got to have been some writing crossover, I think, where some songs were earmarked for Tarzan and some went to Dance into the Light. That's just my theory. I don't know if that's true, but I feel like you can hear it on Take Me Down and River So Wide, songs that would work on Tarzan, and vice versa. Like Strangers Like Me would work on this album. That brings me to a really interesting tidbit about this album that Harry Kim told me when we did the interview just last year, something I didn't know at all. And I'm so curious how it would have worked out. But Phil had recorded these demos and for these songs, some of the songs, and usually when Phil does demos, it's drum machines and it's keyboards, and he's playing a lot of like the guitar parts on keyboards and the sax and muted trumpet parts on keyboards, with the plan to replace them with real instruments later. Well, as we know on both sides, he never did, aside from some drums, maybe some bagpipes, but I don't think so. But on this album, he did the same process, but the plan was to get the band together, to get the Vine Street Horns together, Daryl and Brad, and I don't know who was available at the time, but to bring them to a live club and to rehearse it for a week or a month in a club or in a studio somewhere, and then go and perform these songs, much like a comedian does, in a small club on stage, and maybe even record it live or go back to the studio and record this album live off the floor. So that's sort of what Harry Kim alluded to was the original plan of this album. And then that fell apart. I think at some point during the rehearsals of it, I think they did perform it in a club or at least an empty club. And then I believe at some point, Phil just kind of caved into his demoitis. Demoitis is basically when you've been listening to your own demos for 6 months to a year or more, and you can't hear anything but that. And so anything that you try to make is always measured up to that original demo that has that kind of early virgin sound to it. And it's just impossible to replace, even if you're doing it with real musicians and making a better sound in the end. It just doesn't have the intimacy that your original demos do. And so apparently that's what Phil ran into the problem with. He basically just went back to the original demos and worked off of those. So it's too bad. And I mean, I don't know if people hear the split of this album of like kind of the upbeat, exciting, fun, colorful, vibrant songs, and then the traditional, strumming rock songs. But some of those bigger tunes like Wear My Hat and Dance into the Light have been really interesting to hear an album, a version of this album that's done almost live, but not in the Phil Collins live way, but in the way that's like maybe some mistakes or some, squeaks of a reed on a saxophone or some drumsticks falling on the floor at the end of the song, or Phil counting in, or somebody laughing, or hand claps, that kind of like live and loose off the floor. It's really too bad. It's too bad because, I mean, that's what we heard on the tour, and he spoke so highly of the tour. I think it would have been really cool to hear an album made the old way that people used to make records like this. And it's too bad that Phil chickened out at doing that. I'd love to ask him about that and what happened there. Two other things I want to talk about before we go song by song. First of all, the album cover. Here's the original album cover on CD. Very vibrant. He's kind of handwriting using like lights to write his name, Phil Collins. So it's still handwritten. This is the 2016 version where he retook the photo. It's really well done. I have no problems with this cover. It's orange and vibrant, and I think that's cool. And it still has his handwriting and it still has him on it, but it breaks that tradition. And we'd go back to Testify for that. I don't really consider going back to be a traditional album. I personally replace going back with A Hot Night in Paris. I don't really consider that to be a proper. So I like the album cover, except for the fact that it doesn't kind of follow that profile or straight on face, but it is still him. I don't know. Let me know what you think of the album cover. There's one note I wanted to talk about in here. When I got this CD, and I remember I hadn't even really paid much attention to both sides. And so I remember reading the liner notes because I picked up the CD used when I was a kid in high school. And this is the actual CD I picked up, by the way. Yeah, smells like high school. At the very end of the liner notes, he says, there's no drum machine on this one. And so I think that was like alluding to like how lacking the drums were on both sides and how people were like, where's the fill that we're used to? And so this was definitely a return to the But Seriously sound, more so than both sides, and doing maybe some of the big horns like you heard on Heat on the Street or Hanging Long Enough or Saturday Night. So, and then the drums too. Although I don't really love the drums on this record, and you can tell me what you think, and you can tell me what you think about the drums, but the 90s weren't a great drum sound era. They were kind of like, this sounds like a thinner piccolo style snare. Even the drum patterns, like aside from like River So Wide, but like stuff like Dance in the Light, it's just that constant beat. It's just weird. To me, this isn't an album that showcases Phil's drumming. It's also a weird era for Phil because he had left Genesis. This is weird for legacy or heritage artists because basically you have the time when you are at the peak, right? And so that would have been Invisible Touch, Wembley Stadium. It would have been But Seriously tour, selling millions of records. You know, you're on MTV, you're on the cover of magazines, you're going to number one singles, like you're at the height of your career. Then you kind of come down off of that. And then it's usually a few decades later until you become this like grandfather where people like Peter and Phil are now, or Sting, or where David Bowie was before he passed. This, you know, legacy artist where people look back fondly on their career, even things that they were maybe critical for, they're now not seen as like somebody that needs to be torn down. But that in-between era, and that's the late 90s for Phil, even though he was really busy with Dancing to the Light and Tarzan and A Hot Night in Paris, the critics had no consideration for him, and fans even. I mean, it was a weird era because he's still selling millions of records. He's selling out his tours. He still has a massive fan base who are now just not the cool crowd, right? They're 30s or 40s or 50s now. And the young kids are interested in something else. And so there's really not any place in culture for 40, 50-year-old artists until they become 60s, 70s, and 80s. Then it's like, okay, now these are our legacy artists. We respect them. And when they're in their 20s and 30s, they're the pop artists and they're on the cover of every magazine. So this is a weird era for Phil. Okay, let's go track by track. Title track is great. Dance into the Light, probably one of my favorite songs on this album, one of my favorite openers. You really know what you're getting. I think it's a great song lyrically. It's a beautiful music video. Lyrically, it's all about unity, coming together, but it's not done in a cheesy way. It's not done in a pedantic or patronizing way, as some songs like maybe even Land of Confusion kind of bothers me like that. But this is just a come together. It's almost like it doesn't have a meaning, but it can mean a lot of different things. It can mean just being vibrant and joyful and unified and happy and excited, whatever. It's a great song, great way to open the record. I mean, again, this, you can tell, right? When you make a record like this, and we've seen him touring on Conan to talk about this record, and on Rosie, and on Jay Leno, and it must have been tough, right? Because everybody is interested in an Oasis and darker bands like Smashing Pumpkins and Goo Goo Dolls and Radiohead, and not a lot of room for a sound like Dance into the Light. But 20, 30 years later, we can look back and go, this is a great record. We don't need to kind of judge it for coming out in the 90s. We can just listen to it now and say it's a great record. One of the things I love about this record is the track listing, the track order. I feel like I'm never taken out of the moment. I just feel like it's a constant flow of great music. Whereas I can't always say that. Like sometimes it's like, But Seriously, for example, is like Hanging Long Enough is like massive opener. And then you're like brought way back down with the way it is. And so, but Dance into the Light goes into That's What You Said really, really well. That's What You Said is the first kind of guitar song, right? And again, I think what I really like about this record is how these guitar songs are just kind of like every other, from the more interesting world sounds that he's using on the record. So Dance in the Light, then you have That's What You Said. Then we do Lorenzo, which is weirder and African sounding. And I'm a big fan of That's What You Said. I think I'm a big fan of the deep cuts on this record. There is a sound where Phil's voice is, he calls them guitar songs, and some people call them Beatles inspired songs. And it's actually some of my favorite stuff from We Can't Dance. And that's songs like Tell Me Why or Way of the World, Never a Time. They're just mid-tempo rock songs. And the songs like Never a Time or Tell Me Why mirror songs like No Matter Who or The Same Moon or That's What You Said, or Love Police. Same thing with like Strangers Like Me. Anyway, I really like all the guitar songs. They do kind of blend together. It's In Your Eyes, That's What You Said, Love Police. There is a kind of a similarity between all the songs, but I'm a big fan of the deep cuts on this record. And I mean, there aren't really any massive hits. I guess the biggest hit you would say is Dance into the Light, although I personally think It's In Your Eyes is a way better single. I don't know why in the last two records he would lead off with the title track, both sides, whereas I think Every Day or Can't Turn Back the Years is a better single. And on Dance into the Light, even though it's a good song, I think It's In Your Eyes is a better single. I think even No Matter Who would be a better single. Lorenzo I've never had a problem with that song, but when I found out the meaning of the song about this, like somebody who writes to him about this boy who grew up in Africa who got bitten by something, right? And then got this disease, like a crippling disease or something from this, like, was it like a spider bite or something? When I hear this, I kind of feel like I just liked listening to the song before I knew the story, because now I'm trying to like put the pieces together. I'm like that with lyrics. If I know too much about the meaning of the song, I get distracted, and I don't want to be distracted. Musically, I really like the song, but there's a lyric in here, and it's the disease that the kid gets. And the fact that like thought it was a challenge, a songwriting challenge to shoehorn this actual official disease name into a verse, it blows my mind. He actually does it fairly well, but it's not a song you can find yourself singing along with. Certainly not one I've ever done karaoke to. Otherwise, I'd have to say, adrenoleukodystrophy. Came this monster called adrenoleukodystrophy. Where's my East Africa? I mean, good for him. Like, good for him. He actually like found out how you pronounce it and then fit it into the meter of the song. Let me know what you think about that tune. Just Another Story. This is this kind of like Dick Tracy, sultry, muted trumpet song. Not a big fan of this song. I heard the live version on the extended edition, and the live version sounds a little bit better because the real drums are a little bit more, maybe they're real drums. I suppose they're real drums, but they're just so robotic on the album, where it's just kind of like a basic beat. The beat is beneath Phil. I think Phil could do way better. It's not a nice groove. The drums don't sound very good, and that drum groove just gets in your head, and the song goes on way too long. Like if you listen to the bass and then that drum on that piccolo snare, da, 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 like it's so simple sounding, and it's how any not great drummer would play a beat. And I just don't know why he went for that. I feel like he could have done something so much better. Even songs like That's All, that has a simple beat, it's not really like there's something cool going on, or Throwing It All Away. It's an incredible groove. But this drives me crazy. And maybe because it's almost 7 minutes long. Yeah, I think melodically too, I really dislike this song. We have 13 songs on this album. And remember, that was becoming normal for the end of the 2000s, especially, or sorry, for the end of the 90s into the 2000s, as people started to no longer be interested in CDs. A lot of record companies were jamming as many songs onto an album as possible so that it had more value, so they could charge $20 to $25. I think this is Just Another Story is a song that could be removed. Now, I believe they did it live because Harry Kim talked about dropping the trumpet mute on. You got to listen to my interview about that. The next song is Love Police. It's one of my favorite songs on the album. Dumb name, but it's a good song. That open strum of the electric guitar. This is like one of his best electric guitar style songs on this record. Huge fan of this song. Again, I think Love Police is a weird title because otherwise this could have been a great single, in my opinion. I just don't know if that title would turn people off. I don't know. I don't care. I love the song. Love that song. The next song is Wear My Hat. I will say, I don't know if it's okay. I've put this on my top 5 least favorite Phil Collins songs of all time. I apologize if it's your wedding song or if it was played at your wedding. Maybe you walk down to the aisle to this song. I'll say what's good about it. What's good about it is the idea about writing a song about celebrityism and how absurd it is. So that's cool. I'll give you that. What's not good about it is, like, if you've ever been on a cruise, I hate cruises. I've been on one cruise. I got motion sickness. I couldn't believe how like jam-packed you are with like really gross Americans. Food is good. I'll give you that. And I'm terrified of falling over the deck. But if this song came on, I'd consider jumping. No, I'm kidding. It just gives me that vibe of like being in a conga line with a Corona with a bunch of chubby 50-year-olds on the Lido deck. I don't like this song. I don't like when they played it live. I thought it was goofy. Again, I love this style of music. I love Dancing to the Light. Take Me Down. I love that song. But yeah, this song really, I just don't dig it. I don't dig it. It's probably mostly the music and the lack of melody on the chorus. Sorry. I hope I'm not alone. Listen, I started a Phil Collins YouTube channel, so I'll listen to this song. I probably do listen to this song more than songs by any other artist in the world, but it's at the very bottom of my Phil Collins songs. It's In Your Eyes. I've talked about a lot. It's the second single. You Got to Let Me Know. I don't think it did as well as Dancing to the Light, although it came out in early December, which probably didn't help. But I love it. I really do. I love it so much. It's got that. It reminds me of Can't Stop Loving You. It reminds me of Strangers Like Me. It's just a really good mid-tempo Phil Collins song. It's fantastic. The similarities between this and Love Police is pretty interesting, though. I will say that. Okay, let's move on. Ought to Know by Now. Is it just me, or is it feels like this could be a Genesis tune? It feels like this could be on Invisible Touch as a deep cut, or on Shapes as a deep cut. I don't have a problem with this song. I don't look forward to it. I don't think about it often, but I never skip it. It doesn't bother me in any way. If I were to cut 2 songs, I would probably cut Just Another Story and maybe the Bob Dylan tune, but we'll get there. Ought to Know by Now. It's a long song, and I think it's really cool. Oh, go back to Just Another Story. We got to talk about that piano solo. That can't be a real piano, right? Like that was like the late 90s, like, hey, we've discovered a digital piano that we think sounds like a real piano. It just sounds like a keyboard piano. Sorry, not a fan of that tune. I would cut Wear My Hat too, but I'm not in charge. And I know that was a big live staple, and it's probably a greatest hits for him. So I can't cut that. Take Me Down, love. It's top 5 of this album. Such a cool vibe. I mean, I don't know stylistically. I mean, it's so hard to kind of pinpoint the styles of, but seriously, and I think the same thing can be said too of Dancing to the Light, where Take Me Down is kind of gospel, right? It's kind of like Take Me Down to it's like, Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? Like Take Me Down to the River for baptisms. Like it's got that feel. It's got that Afro feel as well. So there's so many styles happening on this record. Often when I'm listening to it, it just sounds like Dancing to the Light for me. And I don't hear all sorts of different influences. I just hear like a kind of a cohesive, upbeat, vibrant, as Phil says, sound. The pitch bend in the keyboard on The Same Moon is so cool. This is Phil mid-tempo at his best. His vocals are so good on this album, and I love The Same Moon. I think if I had to rank my favorite songs, I would be like Love Police, It's in Your Eyes, not in any order, but Love Police, In Your Eyes, The Same Moon, No Matter Who is really great, River So Wide. Those are my top five. Dance in the Light too, maybe. Yeah, top six. I don't know. This was a single, right? Yeah, it was a single. It was a single after No Matter Who. So it was like a year later. Oh, and it was only a single in Germany. I think it could have done better. Honestly, I think this and Love Police could have done better than Dance into the Light or Wear My Hat. I think. I don't know. I could be wrong. But I think The Same Moon is really cool. Although, they when they were writing Never a Time, and this song, The Same Moon and Never a Time are very similar, in my opinion, similar sounding. When they were writing Never a Time, I think Mike started writing it during the We Can't Dance sessions. I believe it was called like Hit Song or something, or like The Hit or whatever. I think because they thought Never a Time was going to be the lead single for that album. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that's true. And they were totally wrong. No, people don't like that song. I love it. I love Never a Time, and I love The Same Moon. I love also River So Wide. Again, we have this beautiful track listing, the way the Phil doesn't always do this, but how we have like upbeat song, then we have a mid-tempo guitar song, upbeat song, mid-tempo guitar song. So for me, the record flows really nicely. And so you bring it back down with The Same Moon, and then you go back up with River So Wide. And this is where we've got these Tarzan style drums. I'm so curious if this song was part of the Tarzan writing sessions at all. It's cool too, because it reminds me of something that he was sort of experimenting with on both sides a little bit with Survivors and Wait and We Wonder, right? It's just this kind of like giant crescendo. The drums are getting feel like they're getting faster and faster and more intense. And the vocals are great. Now, I personally would have ended the album with No Matter Who. Just kind of a good, almost like the I could have closed the record with River So Wide. Maybe put No Matter Who as a penultimate track, although maybe it's too similar to The Same Moon. But yeah, I would have something like that. I think could have been cool ending. Big fan of No Matter Who. I mean, listen, I've said this a million times, and this is a great music video. It makes me miss Ronnie, who just passed away, R.I.P. But this was a single, and it did okay. The repeated refrain here is we have some really interesting songs, but then the guitar songs all sound the same, but in a absolutely fine way. I mean, this song sort of sounds like The Same Moon-ish, and Love Police and It's in Your Eyes are very similar. But I don't care. I love those songs. In fact, I'm going to make a playlist that's like the guitar songs from here and then the guitar songs from We Can't Dance, because I feel like there's such an interesting overlap. And I really, 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 really like it. It's one of my favorite Phil sounds. We didn't get this type of music on Face Value or Hello, I Must Be Going, and of course not on No Jacket Required. But like in the later career, we would get it. We'd get more of it in Testify. We'd get more of it in Brother Bear or in Tarzan. We didn't get any more of it in Genesis-ish. But yeah, it's one of my favorites. So I'm a big fan of No Matter Who. And it's a long one too. It's almost 5 minutes and it can just keep on going. Really, really cool. The last song is The Times They Are a Changin'. I will say I really like this version. I'm not a Bob Dylan fan. If I was a Bob Dylan fan, if I was a Bob Dylan purist, I would not be kosher with Phil doing Bob Dylan. But here's the thing, Phil. Just don't do Bob Dylan. It's too dangerous. I like your version. I like this song. I like the key change. I think you take his kind of simple version and make it really fun and exciting. A great album, a great stage closer. If you would close the set with this versus Take Me Home every once in a while, it'd be kind of cool. But on an album, I know that Phil has covered the Beatles before, and the Beatles are as big, if not bigger, than Bob Dylan. But that was different because he was covering like a song that most people don't know from the Beatles. Whereas this one's a little bit more iconic, a little bit more familiar. And again, at this time in the late 90s, did we want Phil Collins to be covering Bob Dylan? I just feel like it exposed him a little bit too much for criticism. So I think this song is great. I never skip it. I think it's a great album closer, but we probably it's just too risky. As a Phil Collins apologist, my full-time job is telling people about Phil Collins and Genesis and asking them to give him a fair shot. But I don't think I could really convince people to check out a Phil Collins cover of Bob Dylan. It's just too dangerous, man. It's too dangerous. Like there's some stuff like just, I wouldn't do. Like it's just it. But anyway, having said that, I do really like this song. I really like this version. I think it's really great. If I were to make this album a little bit better, I would probably take off that Bob Dylan cover. I would probably get rid of Just Another Story. That brings us down to 11 songs. And if I was really, really trimming, I would get rid of Wear My Hat because it just bothers me. And then I think we have a beautiful album, an absolutely beautiful album. And I think because it's a little bit bloated, and the same thing we can say for We Can't Dance, I just feel like, and I think you could almost say the same thing for Calling All Stations. I feel like, and for almost every record that came out in the late 90s, early 2000s, I feel like if we killed some darlings, we would be left with a really darn near perfect record. But anyway, that's just me. In the comments, I want you to tell me what you think about Dance Into the Light. What are your top 3 favorite songs? And then what 2 songs would you remove from this record if you could? Let me know what you think of the album, top 3 songs, and what 2 songs would you remove from this record? Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button for exclusive videos, behind-the-scenes content, and to have your say on future topics before I film, have a look at our Patreon page. Thanks for watching.